Hello everyone, welcome to this latest installment of our EU Cross webinar series. I'm Andrione-Moylan from the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, and I will be moderating this webinar entitled Europe and the New Geopolitics of Energy, with Ole Austvik, Professor at Norway University of Applied Sciences, and Kolja Raube, Assistant Professor for European Studies at the University of Leuven. Ole Austvik is Professor of Political Economy at the Norway University of Applied Sciences. He is also a Senior Fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and has been working with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and the Norwegian Business School. He holds a PhD from the University of Oslo, a Master in Public Administration from Harvard Kennedy School, and a Master in Economics from the University of Oslo. Professor Austvik is the author of numerous articles and books regarding international political economy, European integration, global energy economics, and policy. Participating as discussant is Kolja Raube, who is Assistant Professor for European Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Leuven, where he is Program Coordinator at the KU Leuven's Master of European Studies. He is adjunct professor at the American University in Washington, D.C., Brussels campus, and visiting professor at Kobe University in Japan, as well as visiting research fellow at the EU Studies Center at the University of Illinois. Kolja Raube has published widely on the European Parliament, interparliamentary cooperation in the European Union and global governance, as well as security policies, the rule of law, legitimacy, and coherence in EU external action. Thank you both for joining us today. As for the general structure of this webinar, first Professor Austvik will present for about the first hour of this webinar. Then Professor Raube will share his thoughts and comments with us, and Professor Austvik will have the opportunity to reply. As always, during the presentations, you may send your questions and comments to me via the webinar chat box, which you can access from the control panel. After the presentations, I will bring your questions into the discussion and allow our speakers to respond. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to our distinguished speaker, Professor Ole Austvik. We very much look forward to your presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thanks to Kolja for the invitation. It's nice to meet with so many students and so many other people, I understand, coming from many places. And I think this COVID-19 has actually been a breakthrough for using technology in the university sector. I'm sitting on a farm in the middle of Norway, and we can reach each other wherever we are. If you want to be in touch with me later on, I have a home page down on the screen now, www.oga.no, and you can send me a mail or whatever if you want to keep in touch. My topic is today is the new geopolitics of energy in Europe. And I will make a short description of the past and current energy developments and energy dependencies taking place in the especially Western world after the Second World War, and then discuss the changes in market policies and technology, not least, affecting this geopolitical situation with a focus on oil, natural gas, and renewables, which is shaping the new geopolitics of energy. And then come to the first point, what is the new geopolitics of energy? And then I'm referring to a short article I wrote in the International Association for Energy Economics, defining these concepts of geopolitics and energy, and you will find it online from the IEA organization. So the main point is that in classical formulations, the geopolitics as such was a term that described the relationship between political power and the control of territory. It was created in the early 1900s, but after the Second World War, it was not used much because that it was used as a concept for defining the Lebensraum for the Nazi German government. It popped up again in the 1980s and 1990s. And then it is a term that more closely relates it to the economic and political integration that takes place since the Second World War, but especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then it is the control of territory in one way or the other. It must not be military, but it can be in other ways, and how this affects markets and institutions and policies in the world. And it's not only a win-lose game, as the previous term was often defined as, but it can also be a win-win, but one can win more than the other. And that's very much the part of the international political economy today, that we do the integration, economic integration and trade, but we can have different opinions how it should be organized. And today, the biggest geopolitical game in this sense, we see on this graph between the US and China. So actually, the term is now intertwined with many understanding of markets, of international affairs as such. And that's what I will try to describe, how this is changing now, has been changing, is changing, and will change in the years to come. So first then, where we are and have been. This graph is showing how much fossil fuels we use, or all energy usage over a long period of time, 200 years. And originally it was based on wood and then coal. The Industrial Revolution was based on coal usage. And later on came oil, then natural gas, nuclear, etc. And we see from this graph that the growth in energy consumption comes after the World War II. And the growth takes place still in coal, but then oil is shooting up. And later on in the 70s, 80s, natural gas has a rapid growth too. The point here is that the three of them, coal, crude oil, and natural gas, is currently in 2020 representing some 85% of total energy consumption. And this has been the basis for building a modern economy based on this liberal international economic system on manufacturing and trade. If you look at the forecast for what will be in the years ahead, actually most of the growth is expected to come from the fossil fuels. The EIA, it's the Energy Information Administration in the US Department of Energy. I will use many of these graphs. It's very much the same type of numbers that you can get from the IEA, the International Energy Agency in Paris. So this is a consensus forecast saying that energy demand will grow and most of the growth will come from the fossil fuels. You can say that forecasts are always wrong, which is true. So why are they made? They're made because it's an interesting extrapolation of past trends. And if the world continues as it is with expected changes to come, like more renewables and so on, this will be the picture. You have alternative opinions that this will be a greener world, less fossil fuels, and this is one of these scenarios made, and we'll see that still, if this takes place, the fossil fuels will remain dominant, down from 85 to 60, but still more than half of the demand. So the whole world, both old Western industrialization period, the expanded sphere of trade and economic activities, which is global now, will actually be based still very much on the three, more or less, fossil fuels, but with a potential growth of the renewables, which can be large in percentages, but it's only substantial if it comes to a larger technological revolution. And this growth is not caused by the old Western world. It's caused by the new economies coming. So this is also following the economic change taking place. And you see here from this graph, it's Asia, that's China plus some other countries in Asia that will actually represent the bulk of the growth. But also other areas of the world will grow, while the OECD, which is the Europe, North American, Japan, Korea, Australia, and some more, will not grow very much. So it takes place a lot of energy efficiency changes and other energies coming on stream, which will will make the relative weight of the new economies much greater year by year in the years to come. You see here the Chinese energy consumption, which after they entered the WTO in 2002 has been shooting up. And this Chinese new economy is very much based on coal domestically, but also globally, and not so much on other energies. But they are looking for energy everywhere. So, and in this picture, actually, when you see at the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese initiative, which is the largest investment program, it's a changing geopolitical landscape a lot, but not least in energy, because a large part of that is how to give China more energy by sea or by land. So a game changer is that the balance has shifted from already, it's not a forecast, it says already shifted from the old OECD countries to the new economies, and it is expected to grow and increase in the years ahead. The emissions is also a mirror picture of this situation. And you see after the World War II from this graph, the emissions has also been shooting up substantially. And the CO2 emissions, which represent bulk of the greenhouse gases, are actually coming from mostly the usage of the fossil fuels, like 90% or something like that. So obviously, if you want to change the emissions, you have to change the energy composition from fossil to something else, or you have to curb the emissions when these energies are used. So climate policy and energy policy are very closely linked to each other. And also here, we see that these emissions is taking place where the growth in demand is the largest. And again, the Asian economies are representing the bulk of the growth emissions. And that is a challenge, of course. If you want to reduce emissions, it's not enough to do it in the Western industrial world. It has to be done in the growing economies as well, which is a challenge to find agreements that will actually work. So this balance has changed too. that it is not going on in Europe or US, but in Asia, China. If you look more specifically on the old picture of the, and partly current picture of the oil part of the geopolitics of energy, we see here a map of the Persian or Arabian Gulf, depending on where you sit. And the brown spots, that's the oil fields in this area. The red ones are gas fields. If you put a circle here in the inner part of the Persian Gulf, about 200 kilometers radius, you will find something like 50% of conventional reserves. Conventional reserves. I come back to the unconventional American reserves soon. But before they were actually developed in such a large scale as they are now, this was the whole picture. So 50% of these conventional reserves are located in Iran, Kuwait, Iraq, and partly Saudi Arabia, which is a very, very small area. I don't know how big Belgium is, but I think Belgium is larger. I didn't check that. If you expand this area to include the Gawar field in Saudi Arabia, which is the largest oil field in the world and where bulk of Saudi production is taking place, you will have some 2/3 of world conventional reserves. And these are the cheapest to produce and has been dominating the oil market for a very long time. You have some oil in Northern Iraq and in the Emirates. But all this oil in the Gulf, it must come out somewhere, and that's why you have this strategic Strait of Hormuz, where you have 18 million barrels a day, or 20% of world oil consumption, passing every day, which is a lot, which is a very strategic point. And you have some unrest there now between Iran and the US, but a permanent conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So this is a very conflictual area. If you have a map on military positions here, you will find it very nicely fit in with the oil field and the gas fields. But the oil has to come out, and this has been a strategic American view since the 1970s after the first oil shock, that it is a vital American interest to protect the stability and the oil flows from the Arabian Persian Gulf. If you look where this oil was going at the time, this is more or less an illustration. It's an illustration of more or less how it was working. Most of it went to the US and Europe and Japan, the rich old world. And this is the basis for for shaping the politics after the first oil shock. It was created first, the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, were created in order to protect the revenues and political control in oil producing states. And it was then in 1974 met with a matching institution, the International Energy Agency, in the Western world. It's created by Henry Kissinger, Foreign Minister of President Nixon in 1974, as a response to what was considered to be a pressure of the Western world because of this oil dependency and the shocking prices of 300-400% increase in prices in a few months' time. And we see this geopolitical map here. The IEA, the green countries versus the blue countries, the West versus the Arab states. And this has been a situation until recently that the rich world was depending on oil from this area because it was so important. I'll not use much time on this, just to say that this dependency on between regions, countries, is not only about physical supplies, but it's also about a price level and price stability. So the IEA is defining security of supply as depending on the securing of supplies, but also how much you have to pay for it. And obviously this is a conflict of interest because the oil producing countries in the Arab state have a substantial economic rent. It's much cheaper to produce the oil than it is than they get for it. That is also the case for Norway. And this rent is a conflict of interest between the buyer and the seller. I will not dwell much about the current situation on the COVID-19, which is changing the energy a lot. Prices are down. We don't know what will happen, but I will not use time to discuss because it's so much uncertainty concerned with that. And maybe the questions later on will come on to that in some extent. Point now is that the crude oil flows from the Gulf is now looking like this. Almost nothing to the United States, oil to Europe, to the Suez Canal, but most of it goes to Asia. And if you look at a couple of years ahead, this will be the only picture. All of it will go to Asia, some of it to Europe, nothing to the United States. This is a map showing flow of tankers from the Persian Gulf last year, from 14-day period of 1 month in last year. And we see this, how this is now already the case, more or less. It's not many ships going down here anymore. So it is a change. The location, the strategic position of the Middle East as an oil producing area is a different importance for especially US now, less so for Europe, but still less. But it's very important for the Asian economies. Then something happens. Why is no oil going to the United States? And that is caused by the American energy revolution. After the Second World War, it was a strong opinion that oil and gas and coal are finite resources, exhaustible resources. So if you use 1 barrel of oil, you can't sell it another time. It will run out. And this peak oil Hubbert curve was made in the 1950s, showing the idea that all oil wells actually have such a bell-formed shape, big or small, but eventually any field will run out. And Hubbert, he was an engineer in Shell, the oil company Shell. He made this curve valid for a whole region. So that means that in the US, for instance, you had such a shape of a bell-formed shape for the production in the Midwest, the stripper wells, which will go down, and they went down in the 1970s. And the idea was that this curve was actually valid for the whole world. So we will run out of oil, and the peak oil and gas. And the peak oil theory had a lot of supporters like 10 years ago, showing different types of future. When will we peak? This is just one of them, distributed on different sources, different types of energies, oil and gas and others. And this one is suggesting that we'll run out now. And you have others. The important point is that this was, there was a discussion when the peak will come, but not actually if it will come. So some had a peak like in 2050 or later too. But what really changed this picture was this American energy revolution. And this picture is showing the illustration how you find hydrocarbons in the ground. So what we've been doing, like in Saudi Arabia, you're drilling for gas or oil at the top of the surface. You can also go to the bottom of the sea and you drill on the bottom of the sea, like in Norway, and you find conventional oil and gas. But if you go deeper down, you will find actually a lot of oil and gas in the sand, stones, rocks, in coal layers further down. The further you go down in the ground, the more you find. And I could have shown you a video on this, how this is going on, but I will just describe it this time, I think. So you drill down from the top to the layer where you have this sand or rocks or other stuff mixed with the oil and gas. If you pump water into this layer and you have some chemicals too, but a lot of water, you will break the stones and will split the oil or gas and the stones, and you can pump the oil and gas back onto the top of the platform. And as technology improved and you can drill not only vertical down, you can drill horizontally down, and you can actually drill in many directions. You can expand this possibility from one single point on the surface to cover a large area. And that means that in a larger scale, you will make it cheaper, and it became so cheap step by step after 2000, in the late 2000, almost 10, that it will start to be profitable for a large amount of reserves in the US. And this is a map showing how the reserves was considered to be located in the United States. Look at the number here, it's 2009. It's a lot of areas, no? And you find some of the most important ones here in Texas area, Barnett, Woodford, Eagleford, which was starting with the horizontal drilling and expanding the production quite rapidly. But you also find it not least in North Dakota, the Bakken, and also here in Marcellus and other areas. But look at 2009. This is 2011, 2 years later on. It's almost doubled, meaning that in the United States, as perceived, the reserves were not anymore finite. It was no actually economic limit to how much you can produce. The reserves were not a limit to how much you can produce. The economics are. But they were so huge that at the price levels considered then, you could actually just expand production a lot. Many think that these reserves are located this way all over the world. In many maps made for this type of reserves. So this is just one. If it's right or wrong, I don't know. It's not important here. Point is that if this is true, if this map or some other map is true, then you will have a lot of oil and gas available for the future. It has not been successful like in Poland, has worked a lot to find shale gas, to become more independent from Russian gas. It was not very successful. Maybe the first shale gas will come in Britain. I think France has prohibited it because of pollution possibilities. But this is a great uncertainty, whether or not it will spread to a significant extent to other places than the US, North America. Meaning that the bell curve shaped in the American oil production since the early 1900s. You have the Midwest, you have some Alaska coming here, but together they will dropping down to I just have to get rid of some not leave number. Okay, I think it's working now. Going down in the down to approximately 2010, 10 years ago, when the shale oil production started to grow rapidly. And already in a few years, they were coming back to the peak of the 1970s. And last year, I think I have found a number of or more than 12 million barrels a day, more oil production than ever, making actually the US the biggest oil producer in the world. This is maybe not so easy to see, but you have the big producer now, United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. You have United States, the green one, coming back here 10 years ago, much smaller than the two others, growing here, falling a little bit back after the oil prices dropped in 2014, and then coming back here, and over the last couple of years, they've been bigger than both Saudi Arabia and Russia in terms of production. Biggest producer in oil of oil in the world, making it independent of imports from the Persian Gulf. So a big game changer for the geopolitics of oil and for gas also is the American energy revolution. And we see here the oil production in the US is, according to the American, the US Department of Energy statistical office here, that it will flatten out over the next years. I don't know if it's true or not, but that is showing that all this oil here is coming from the shale production. The other are the Midwest, the Mexico, Alaska. For gas, however, you have a deep situation with falling domestic production in the United States. Then comes, and they wanted to import a lot of gas in terms of, with the floating LNG. But they were with the shale gas production were increasing, and they are now actually expecting that this gas production will continue to increase. So if you see, meaning also that they become such a large oil and gas producer, that they produce more than they consume, and they are now a net natural gas exporter rather than importer expected only 10 years ago. It is important, however, to see that while the US has become a natural gas exporter, it is still an oil importer, because the consumption is even higher than the production. But what they import now is less, and it's coming from more close by countries like Mexico, Venezuela, Canada, I think some from Norway too, but we are not so big in this anymore. And depending on how much domestic production will increase in oil, they will remain an importer to some extent in the years ahead, or not. That depends on the developments. The EU is in a different situation, because the EU as such have not much oil production inside the EU. Most of the oil to the EU is coming from Russia and partly Norway. Otherwise, they get the oil from the North America or from Africa, meaning Nigeria and some others, and from the Persian Gulf and the former Soviet republics, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. So this is a different situation. It's not changed that much. It's more as it has been in the EU. For natural gas, and then I focus mostly on Europe. This is the grid for natural gas in 1970 and 2000. That is a period of 30 years. And in 1970, it was not much natural gas usage in Europe, mostly local gas. And the first international project was with the Groningen field in Holland in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s, where they started to export gas to the neighboring countries, Germany, Belgium, France. In this period, when you should build a gas market, it was long-term contracts between the producer and the buyer, which was mostly the transmission networks in the consuming countries. And these long-term contracts, not much competition with prices set below the competitive energies. You had a period of huge growth of the network, both in producing states and in consuming states, EU states. And 3 other producers came on stream: Norway, Russia, and Algeria. And you see the network here from Rurgas showing the network. Only in this period of time, it was growing quite fast, but not very much as a market, liberal market economy. It was agreement between the huge producing companies and huge transmission companies supported by governments. But when you come in this period, when you have a developed infrastructure, it has some advantages in terms of long-term planning for both sides of the market, but it has some disadvantages in terms of it's not very flexible, and you can deny third-party access to the network and so on. So the EU started to look at the possible changes in this market. And they made many packages for energy to liberalize electricity market, natural gas markets, 3 energy packages and 1 energy union in order to try to make these markets more flexible, because the need for these long-term contracts was not that significant anymore as long as the network was developed. For new areas, however, this is a different story, but for a developed area, it made sense that the EU tried to make this more competitive. And they was actually following the traditions from the United States, where it was called a deregulation. In Europe, it mostly calls a liberalization, but it's really the same thing, that you should try to make the market work where it's possible, and you should regulate it or owned by the public if it's not working. And a lot of the transportation in electricity and gas are national monopolies. So they have worked with a lot of competitive policies to make it more flexible, transparent, more interconnectors inside, outside, and an agency for cooperation of the regulators to harmonize as far as possible. But this is still not completed. It's on the way all the time. One problem for in the geopolitical, so this is important because if you make a market more competitive and liquid, you will be less vulnerable for external changes too. You can change if something happens. But the security of supply issue is, so it's a major concern, especially for Eastern and Central European countries, which depend so much on Russian gas. And these policies are mostly dealt with bilateral. It's not a part of a foreign policy program. If you look at the security supply problem, this is from the External Action EU. What happened in 2009 when the taps were turned off for gas between Russia and Eastern and Central Europe. You see how much each country lost of their supplies during the winter. And in the winter it's cold, so it was really harmful. People froze to death. To be so dependent on one single source is difficult. But it makes also a situation where the interdependence between Russia and Europe is quite significant. How can you deal with it? This is still a highest priority in many of these countries, the dependency on Russian gas. And also from Russian point of view, if you see this pipeline infrastructure, which is built during the Soviet era, going from the east of petroleum, oil and gas production in Western Siberia to the west, supplying Russia, supplying their former satellite states in Eastern Europe, and then later on also to the Western Europe. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, this is still the main infrastructure for transporting oil and gas out to citizens and to markets for Russian energy. If you look at the problem of 2009, it was actually like 80% of gas from Russia went through Ukraine. And in revenues for oil and gas is the very dominant for state revenues in Russia and for export revenues, even though oil is more important than natural gas. But for gas and Gazprom, it was a big problem that you had such a dependency from their point of view. So actually they suggested then they wanted to go around Ukraine and build a pipeline north and south of Ukraine, Nord Stream, South Stream. And actually Nord Stream is partly realized already in 2011-12, the first one. And you have a big conflict about the second part of it. It's a huge dimensions, which Putin says it will be started in the end of 2020. We'll see, but it is largely being built. So this is a way to change the geopolitical position of Ukraine, actually, to avoid them as a problem for reaching Russian gas to Europe. And it's also a problem for EU coherence that the German-Russian consortium, Russian dominated, but still Germany and Russia wants this pipeline, while Poland does not want it because they feel trapped between Germany and Russia then. The other one was not realized, the South Stream, but the Turk Stream was the alternative, and it has also opened just recently, going across the Black Sea from Russia to the western part of Turkey. And this is also, it's a bit smaller dimensions, but this is also a way is changing the geopolitics of Ukraine, but also these new areas. Let's see. What is happening here is that you get what we're talking about now is gas transported in pipeline. The LNG is liquefied natural gas. This gas has been a transportation method for a long time in the Asian market between Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Korea, Japan, the sea lines. But it's been quite expensive. It's become cheaper, and it has growing a lot as a way of transport by sea. If you look at this graph, the cost of pipeline versus LNG, that the exact numbers, I don't know, I will not emphasize that, but the principle shows that pipeline transportation over shorter distance is much cheaper than the LNG. But over longer distances, when you make the liquefaction plant, meaning you freeze the gas from a gas to a liquid and put it on a tank, and if you have the receiving plant, the regasification, where you make the liquid a gas again, you can transport it over quite a long distances without incurring much more costs, meaning that you don't have to have a neighboring buyer as you need with a pipeline. You can have a buyer on the other side of the globe. And if you look at Qatar, that was a red spot on the Middle East map I showed you. They have been benefiting from this, and over just a couple of decades, they've been growing to, I think, the second largest exporter of natural gas in the world after Russia. Norway is number 3, so they passed Norway. And all these gas are based on LNG. And it's been increasing very fast. And so this is another transport through the Hormuz Strait. And if you look at the trade of gas totally, it has been increasing on the left-hand graph here. The total trade is increasing, the trade in LNG is increasing, the pipeline is down. On the right side of the graph, you see Europe is importing increasingly more, China also, but the US again is reflecting the shale revolution there, where you have less, so much production that you are now a net exporter. So this is a new picture. The markets for natural gas have moved from regional to global. The last point is the main point for energy, that is the renewables. And the EU has been a forerunner for making the economy more green, for more renewables, for energy efficiency. And Germany, the Energiewende, is considered very often to be the example of what is possible. I saw a number, 46% of consumption of electricity is now based on renewable energies. And the goal is to end the usage of coal and also oil and gas in the long run. And if you see the trend of renewable energy cost, look at especially the solar energy cost. Just 10 years ago was this high. It's now only a fraction of the cost. So technological change is very important here, because 10 years ago, a large expansion of solar energy was quite difficult. Now, from a cost perspective, it is possible. The question is then, how can you produce this electricity? Again, the fossil fuels today are about 85% of all energies, nuclear 4% and hydro 7%. The other energies are only 4%. Solar, wind, wave, biofuels. So even if you change this production 100% increase in these other renewables, it will still not amount to a dominant share of total energy consumption. So this is really an issue, and you have to produce it where you have wind and solar, sun and wave. It will obviously increase a lot. It has been depending on high prices of the alternatives like oil, gas and coal. But if they will remain low, it can be also sold by governmentally help, of course, if that is strongly enough desired. But the problem here to change from the fossil fuels to the alternatives is probably true in the long run, but you need a breakthrough of a significant size in order to make it to the extent that the fossil man goes into the museum together with with the other ages of stone and bronze and iron. The Stone Age did not end because of lack of stones, but because of a different technology. More uncertain than many of the other changes, but still important for policies. Taking it together, in old times, which we partly still old times, but not as much as before, EU has been an hegemonic state in the Western world, and fossil fuels has been the basis for building the modern economy, based on industrialization and trade. Hegemonic in the Western world, and later on, after the Cold War ended, for the for the global world, even though the superpower rivalry with Russia has been re-emerged to some extent. Oil and then natural gas became strategic commodities, and these commodities were located mostly in non-Western places. And you have the IEA concepts of vulnerable and sensitive economic and political import dependency, shaping policies for a long time. Examples are the oil crisis starting in 73, later on in 79, 80, 85, 86, again and again, OPEC, Arab states. But you listen to now to Donald Trump. He's not against OPEC. He wants to cooperate with them, and he takes a telephone to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and President of Russia, the three big ones, and they talk about how to stabilize the oil market. He wants to regulate it. It's a new world, but it hasn't been like that. After the shale revolution, it's changed the American policies. The natural gas crisis is mostly a European thing, where you had during the Cold War and later on several incidents with Russia, either with Western Europe, Soviet Union, or with East and Central Europe, Russia. You have the Ukraine crisis directly linked partly to these issues. That's been a long-lasting picture. And in this period, markets, which is important part of the geopolitical analysis, on both the supply side and the demand side were not very competitive. They were very imperfect. You had OPEC, Russia on the supply side for oil and gas, but you also have quite a monopolistic situation where you had very few buyers on the other side, on the OECD side. It was very important for both producers and for consumers, producing and consuming countries, to play with it on both economic and political grounds. In this period, the peak oil was considered possible. It was a reality. Finite resources. This has, with the shale oil revolution, it has changed a lot, and maybe because of the renewables too, but that is left to see how much it is able to penetrate the markets. So the interest between Western Europe, the EU, and Western Europe mostly at the time were mostly shared to both Russia and to Middle East, and how to deal with this energy efficiency, liberalization of market and so on, very much the same. And very much the same also on the other side of the OPEC countries, Russia and more. The new geopolitics, you have a situation where you get a new superpower rivalry. This time it's China and the US, partly Russia, mostly China. You have an economic and political and perhaps ideological shift from west to east, And in terms of energy, the growing centers are in China and others. India may come as a very important player also in this respect. At the same time, you have uncertainty about European developments. What will happen? Differentiation, Brexit, will it consolidate? Will it be weaker or stronger? In market terms, they are more mature, they're flexible, competitive, no peak oil gas. They look a little bit more like competitive markets, not fully, but on the European and American way, it is much more flexible than it's been. It's not perfect, and also on the global scale, it's more flexible. In this situation, environment and climate concerns were more or less forgotten in the old geopolitics of energy, but in the new geopolitics of energy, it's very important. But there are very big regional differences, and it's a big question: what will China and the Asian countries do? Because that's where the main problems are, just because they are so big and will become bigger. So in this new world, the US energy positions and interests have changed or is modified, and things are moving faster than before. So my last slide is just to go through these different areas in a little bit more detail. For oil, more self-sufficient US, OPEC less important. Some say that Donald Trump is now the president of OPEC. Well, that's very extreme, but we'll see. Market changed. The big suppliers are not the same as the big ones before. More shale oil will probably come, depending on price. But if you see what happened with the shale oil production after the drop of prices in 2014, the production dropped. But 1 year or two later on, cost dropped too. So they become much more efficient. The whole oil industry reduced costs a lot. So what will happen now? We'll see. But even though but the point is that the short-term impact might be different than the long-term impact. So I would say more shale oil will come in the future. While the EU depends on the imported oil, but have a little bit different structure in it. Russia and Norway is important, but still the Middle East and more Middle East, North Africa countries are important, creating different positions towards the Middle East in terms of energy in the US and the EU, as the US is now more or less independent of this import, as opposed to what they were in the 1970s and Kissinger made the IEA. So we'll see what happens here in terms of also the IEA maybe. For natural gas, markets have moved from regional being global, making EU less dependent on these single sources, the pipeline exporters. The growing number of receiving terminals, the regasification terminals, are huge, represent a substantial change that they will import more by boat and by pipeline. There's a lot of differences within the EU because not all countries have a coastline. But the diversification in the EU is important. And also they considered to substitute coal with natural gas, so it might be increase in more gas. While at the same time, US is a natural gas exporter, not an importer anymore. Also more to come, and they will be not importer and as a well, excuse me. At the same time as they become an exporter, they and at the time they were actually then with the gas conflicts with the Russians before, they've been supporting the West European dependence or reduced dependence on West European import of gas from Russia, partly because of superpower relations. They want to limit Russia's income and expansion. So this will probably also continue, and we see it partly in the discussion about Nord Stream, also with Germany, Poland, US, Russia, Poland support, Poland, Russia support Poland and the US together in this view. So it's a mixed picture. The renewables will grow, but it takes a lot of time. EU is a world leader, and climate policy is good energy policy, so it should continue. But again, it's a big difference to the United States. Maybe a new president will be different, but the Donald Trump leaving the Paris Agreement and not emphasizing climate issues very much, it's a very big difference between in views and policy making between the US and the EU. So taking it all together, I think US and the EU will continue the cooperation in many ways. It's so many similarities and interests shared in general, but it will probably adopt different policies in the geopolitical energy landscape because of these changes taking place and because of the positions they have in these changes. So like the US is formulating now more America for America, probably, and I think already EU energy policy must be formulated increasingly more on its own premises and not a little bit less on a joint Western with interest with the US. And then it's obviously a question how this can be done in a scenario where you don't know exactly how the EU develops in a fragmented or a more consolidated way, because the differences between member states in energy issues are so substantial in some cases. So that's my last slide, and I thank you so far and look forward to the questions and answers later on. Alex, your turn.
Yes, thank you, Ole, for this fascinating presentation. Kolja, would you like to share with us some comments before we go to the Q&A with our audience?
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you, first of all, Ole Gunnar Austvik, for this excellent presentation. I saw some of the slides before last year in Norway and thought this would be an excellent lecture for an audience that is highly interested in the topic, not only of energy, but also the geopolitics of energy. And I think your presentation has made very clear not only what we are talking about when we talk about geopolitics and the geopolitics of energy, but I thought most fascinatingly that you are pointing to developments and changes over time. And that is, I think, what I would like to focus on, and then perhaps to ask a couple of questions, if only to kick off our debate. In the meantime, everybody, as I've wrote already in the chat, would be more than welcome to actually raise their questions in the chat function. So first, first observation, first change over time is Asia, or let's put it that way, the increasing need of energy supply to Asia, the consumption that rises and that alternates, if you like, the situation of important actors in the field on energy. And the second observation, obviously, is what you were talking about when you looked at the United States, what is actually happening to the oil producing world. And here we can see that the US is trying to become more self-sustainable and has actually become the largest oil producer in the world, which is obviously fascinating. It obviously always looks differently when we are looking at gas at the same time. And then at the same time, another very interesting observation I found was obviously your focus on Russia, Russia's dependence on export of energy, of gas and oil, mainly oil, and how this needs to basically weaved into a net of consumers, especially then you focused on Europe, be it in the gas, but also in the oil consumption. Last but not least, perhaps fourth big change is the fact of climate change, or what we may call the question of, well, which technological changes will follow and which are needed. And this is basically where the renewables are coming into the picture. And I thought that was interesting as well. And you showed obviously that by I have to look into my notes, but that by 2050 fossil fuels will go down to 60% overall. So even then, in 2050, energy, if we are taking these estimates seriously, even then, the new renewables will only be up to 40%. So all of this is actually leading us to a couple of remarks on the geopolitics of energy. And I have simply a couple of questions which may kick off the debate. They are mainly from a European perspective, I may say. So the first question is indeed, who drives, so to speak, in the future, the agenda of this geopolitics of energy. Geopolitics of energy assumes, I guess, that states are very much driving the debate forward, but at the same time, we could think about new actors, perhaps actors that are becoming much more important, such as non-governmental industrial actors, such as, for example, in Germany, where we see that the Energiewende, which you already quoted, well, it's not only pushed by the government, it's pushed by big industries that have plans in the closet, so to speak, and are ready to pull them out to actually invest and to actually lead perhaps to a more, well, perhaps self-sufficient Europe in energy. So who is actually driving the agenda here? We are seeing that the European Commission has pushed forward the New Deal, and at the same time we see the member states which are very split. We see Poland taking a very different approach, for example, compared to other member states. But even there, I wonder, with your insight knowledge on these matters, how do you see this map of European member states, right? Who is actually pushing this agenda, and who would rather, let's say, hold on to the new geopolitics of energy without, so to speak, a focus on renewable energies? What is the role here of countries? I think, for example, of the Netherlands. I think, for example, of countries that are also quite heavily, so to speak, involved in some of the old, so to speak, energies. And I would like to hear your point on that. Another question is, for me, the EU-US relationship, which you have been focusing on in your conclusions. And of course, there is always, when we talk about the transatlantic relationship, there's one organization that comes to mind, that's NATO. Norway is a member of NATO as well. So the question here is a question about energy security. And the question, well, do we still speak the same language of energy security? Are we perhaps looking into different interests meanwhile, and what does that mean for transatlantic cooperation in the long run when it comes to actually defining common objectives towards energy security? And last but not least, I would like to hear your opinion on some of the latest so to speak, initiatives by the European Union, for example, in its connectivity framework towards Central Asia. We see on the one hand the European Union being very interested in a New Deal, pushing the New Deal forward, but at the same time we see investments, geopolitical investments we may call it, in, for example, Central Asia when it comes to the production of gas. which in the long run will most likely then be in the benefit of gas consumptions in the European Union. So the question is here, well, how can we make sense of this kind of double-edged approach of the European Union right now, on the one hand pushing the New Deal, but at the same time still investing in some of the old, if you may call it that way, energies? Thank you very much again. It was a very fascinating lecture.
Thank you, Kolja. Very challenging remarks. I think it's important, these different views and regional differences. When you think about driving the agenda on the global scale, obviously China will be more important because they will be so big and they're so active. They're very much run by state interest, directly or indirectly, to the state companies, and energy is a very central part of their project, and the Belt and Road Initiative reaches all the way to Europe. So on a global scale, I think that will be a major shift in terms of energy, and also it's a question then how they will deal with the climate change and the environmental stuff. You see some, and they generally, you say rich country concerns are more concerned with the environment and climate than poor countries. And China is a growing economy from poor to rich. Most of China is still not rich. And we see which they are not less concerned with the climate change issue than in our countries. They are concerned with local pollution issue and so on because of necessity, but the climate issue not that much. You see some of the same thing in the Eastern European countries. So when I go to conferences in Eastern Europe, they are not very much concerned about with the climate issue, environmental issue either, not as much as when you meet people from Western Europe. It's a split, as you also indicated, between East and Western Europe. They're more concerned with economic growth and dependence on Russia, as they have been for a long time. Probably this will converge over time, but just now it's a bit fragmented. And the EU itself, the Commission itself, in energy policy issue, they've been very concerned with competitiveness, the single market in the global world, and so on, to make it working better. Less so than on the specifics of the energy industry, and also the ACER on the making the market more functional, and so on, is very much concerned with competitiveness, which is good. And flexibility improves the security of supply for the East European countries too. So I think it will converge over some time. But again, it's an uphill still, and voluntary organizations pushing governments to green policies, I think, will be quite important in the future too. Whether or not they will sustain or not, I think many people working with climate and environmental policies now are a bit sad, because we forget its importance during the crisis of COVID and its lower prices for oil and so on. They consider it very much as a downturn. But I think still it will be they will be very important if they're able to push or not push in the years ahead in our type of countries. Then you have again a different situation where you have more authoritarian type of governments, and then the climate and environmental issues will be weaker probably. And you have more authoritarian governments all over the world, also within Europe, you could say, and you don't know what happens with Europe. So I think it's very important how EU will develop. And in my view, sitting outside the European Union, in some way at least, I'm not sure whether it will fragmentate or it will consolidate and become a further integrated common area. And then again, EU has been a front runner in the climate policy, environmental policy, which is partly energy policy, and that if that continues, the EU itself might be a force, maybe more so than national governments in some cases. About the US-EU relations, it's partly back to more bigger issues than only energy. I think energy is quite important, has been quite important, because it's so central for the well-being and for the economic developments. And these links between producers not being part of the good societies and with the West has been a central part for both sides. When you see the changes in the US and EU positions in terms of both oil, and that means towards the Middle East, Israel issue is still there, but still the oil part of the Middle East conflict is different for the EU and for the US. The gas issue, where you become the different views, like German-Russian cooperation in gas versus the US interest in containing Russia, it will be you see a split within the EU on this, between Poland and Germany too, no? So and energy security is part of NATO, what I work with, no? They've been for all the time. So I don't think it will change it fundamentally, because you have so many other interests. It's a type of societies we have so many similarities in political structures and interests otherwise. But it might be a bit different. For example, towards Russia, it might be. So, but I don't see the big split between Europe and the US because of this. It's more like modifications. When it comes to the Central Asian, which is I didn't touch very much upon it, but I had one map, and in this map it was showing the pipeline, the new pipeline from Russia to Turkey, but also showed another pipeline, which I guess you were referring to, which is coming from Azerbaijan through Turkey, which has been a competing pipeline. And I think it is an interesting thing in the coming years, because you have a pipeline, the Southern Corridor, I think it's called, the one from Azerbaijan through Turkey, through Georgia and Turkey, has been planned for a long time, but it's costing a lot. It's very long distances. Turkey is a very long country. And infrastructure by pipeline is very expensive. And it shall be financed by the project itself. So when I wrote a paper there with a colleague from Azerbaijan, actually, about Turkey's role in this, which was very interesting to see how they consider it from the Azeri side too, that the game was going on. Who was the first investor? If you have the first pipeline, it will be much more difficult for the next pipeline. In Russia, you have a different logic, partly maybe Turkey too. I shouldn't say that maybe, but perhaps that you have the state more actively into the investments. So in Gazprom, making a pipeline, they can make a investment which is in our calculations unprofitable, but for a long-term state perspective, it's profitable from a wider perspective. And that's why the Russians can build infrastructure faster and into a larger scale than in the West, because they calculate it in different ways. And that's one reason for the EU being against the Russian pipeline through the Black Sea, which originally should end in Bulgaria, because they were not behaving according to competitive principles. But from another side of view, when they find a partner that is not objecting to these non-competitive practices, Turkey, they can do it. But in the southern corridor from Central Asia, it should go from Azerbaijan, but it could be extended to more countries, also from the Middle East, actually. They have not the same type of state activism as you find with Russia. So again, you have how can a competitive democracy compete with an autocratic, not so democratic state? That might be a challenge for the process in a larger scale in the years ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these very, very interesting answers. And I think there are many more questions now. I can already see that in the chat. So I give the floor to Alex to moderate this a bit. Thanks for now.
Okay. Thank you, Kolja.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. Yes, we'll now start with our Q&A. And we've had quite some questions, starting from questions that focus on both the US and, of course, the issue of shale gas. So we have a broad question from Nusret Ipek, who asks, what does the growing independence in the area of energy mean for Asia and the Middle East in the long run? But then we also have some more, let's say, critical questions, which question to what extent can we predict that US independence in this area will continue, especially considering how, for example, some researchers argue that US oil is too light to be refined in existing refineries, and so great investments would need to be made to create refineries that are able to transform the extracted oil. And that is from Saadet Ulku. And another area that the audience has been touching upon is, of course, the Arctic. We have Cedric Piret, who highlights how the Arctic contains an estimated 30% of the world's undiscovered gas and 13% of the world's undiscovered oil. Due to climate change and ice melting, the production costs are reducing. And so what do you see could be the potential impact of these kinds of developments? And then, of course, we have other questions that instead relate to EU-Russia energy relations and the capability of the EU to develop its energy independence, and what Jonas Lammens defines decoupling from Russia in this area. He has several questions, such as, why do you think dependence on imported gas is less problematic for Europe now than before? And do you think the EU has the necessary competencies to carry out this kind of decoupling? And then we have also another question in this area from Alexandros Zakariadis, who asks, what are the prospects of greater cohesion, especially within the EU, especially given that Russia has been able to exploit divisions within the EU, giving better prices, for example, to some member states such as Germany, and worst to others? I think we can start with these questions and then perhaps have a second round.
No more yet. That was a lot. That was a lot. Well, the first question was how the shale gas from US affect the Asian area. Is that rightly understood?
Yes, Asia and the Middle East.
Yeah. Yeah. So the shale, first of all, the shale oil affects directly Middle East in terms of that the US not importing oil from that area anymore or soon. So the shale gas, well, first of all, in Asia, the LNG market and flexibility, the transportation over longer distances affect the market that it becomes global, not regional as it's been. It's been locked in Asian area before the LNG expansion become global. So prices on a global scale will balance, be more similar. And I think some of the shale gas from the United States goes first to Asia because it's been higher prices there. But that will equal out over time when the capacity between the regions will be expanded. So that will be very important for all LNG traders, being exporters and importers, that the price will become more global, maybe not equal, but more similar, and I can get the gas from anywhere. So you saw the graph with the transportation cost, that the distance is not that important. So I think that will be the most important there, that the US will continue to export LNG to Asia as long as the prices are higher there, and to Europe when the prices are higher. This is very much commercial decisions, as opposed to before. In Europe, this has been very political issues. Now it's a commercial issue much more. US has also been a very political issue to regulate, how to regulate wrong, deregulate, changing policies over the decades very much. It's very political too. Now it becomes more a commercial issue, partly political, to expand pipelines within the United States to take away bottlenecks. It's been stopped several times from environmental organizations. So it's a political issue there too. But when you expand it, the infrastructure enough, then it becomes a commercial issue, and you create a market which will now be supply and demand determined, how it will work both for European imports as well as Asian importers, and for countries far away from anything finding gas resources. They can now become exporters of gas, which was not possible as long as you had the pipeline dependence. You find such countries in Asia, Africa, Australia, that will reach markets in different places. So it's a very big change, just 1 or 2 decades. And Qatar is the biggest player now, partly because they have the biggest reserves. If the shale industry will continue its growth, the shale industry in the US is different from other countries. In other countries, almost all countries, you have a strong governmental intervention in decisions, how to produce, when to produce, where to produce. You have different regimes for that. In Norway, we have a mixed government, state, industry solutions. In other countries, you have a state. You have different solutions, but in the end, it's very much a political issue. In the United States, you can start to produce if you have a well in your garden. That's why the shale production can increase so fast. And that means also that when the growth in the industry came, it incurred a lot of costs too. When the prices dropped in 2014, it dropped faster than anywhere else, but they managed to decrease costs, which was very high, in a couple of years. The same happened in Norway. We had the costs of production in 2 years was about half, 50% in a very short time. Whether that will happen now, it's depending. It's a pain issue where you have with prices like $30. I think most of the shale industry will survive in the United States, but it will not increase much. Maybe decrease, but it's a conflicting area. If they manage to decrease this production costs again, and it is also not, it is dependent also the size of the fields, then they might cut costs and increase further. But of course, it's uncertainty as the most vulnerable production area, but they will be faster to decline and faster to increase than anywhere else because of this private mechanism that you have. The commercial actors will do the decisions more so than any other place where you have political decisions, which will be much slower. In the Arctic, definitely the Arctic is not profitable for production in these prices. So compared to the US, actually the production of oil and gas in the Arctic might be even higher. It depends a lot on the size of the project. In Arctic, in the US, you have small fields, relatively small. They are bigger and bigger, but still small. In the Arctic, you have to be huge. And it's easier with oil than with natural gas because oil can be pumped on a ship and transported, while gas has to be transported either by the pipeline to onshore, like the Stockman field, very expensive, or it has to be liquefied for LNG, which is also a costly plant. The problem with the Arctic is it's icy, it's cold, but it's also long distances to supply routes for helicopters, for services, all kind of infrastructure. So it makes it more complicated and expensive. Then of course you have the environmental risk. It's cold there, and any pollution will be much more harmful in Arctic than in other places where it's warmer. So I think from a price and cost perspective, much of the offshore projects in Arctic is not very profitable. You have some in Norway, while in Russia, more or less all the production is onshore. But it's very cold, and in Siberia, but it is onshore in Russia. And probably Russia has more potential reserves in the Arctic Sea than in Norway. But they have enough, as they say, they have enough reserves on land. So I see maybe that some of this Arctic production will be not considered because of price, cost, risk considerations. But as the sea opens, and if you saw the Belt and Road map from the Chinese or the Chinese Belt and Road map, you had also a polar route. So you can transport anything, including oil and gas, through this route. And I think that's more likely to take place. And actually, Russia is building a gas shipping plant from Yamal together with the help with a Chinese company. So they will actually produce gas and ship it to China through this route. It is possible to transport in parts of the year already, but if the climate changes take place to an extent that some expect, that will be open sea, the northern route will, I think, quite surely be much more trafficked than it is now. So I would say transportation, yes. Production offshore will be more difficult, but you have pressure also in Norway. You have a discussion in Norway whether or not to produce. How far north shall we go? Where is it risky? Where is not risky? How can you do it from an environmental point of view? But I will also say, how can you do it from a long-term cost perspective with the uncertainty? Then you say EU-Russia and ability to decouple states. So you're thinking about Poland, Germany, for instance, and the Nord Stream. In some way, I see this Nord Stream is if you consider it as a commercial project, then you might say that if the Russians want to invest so much money, not maybe profitable from a commercial point of view, again, how in the way we calculate it in the West, why don't let them do it? And then we get flexibility and oversupply, and that's good for consumers. But on the other hand, you see the Polish argument and the Molotov-Ribbentrop treaty that you lock Poland in between Germany and Russia. So they are very much against it from this type of perspective. So what this project actually do, I think, is pushing Poland closer to the United States because they have the difference. So the Polish attitudes are very, very anti in this respect, when the very afraid of the Russians. But whether or not the Russians are able to play the states against each other, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that, because even though Germany want to do a commercial deal with the Russians, they've done that for a much longer time, and the same type of arguments were also put forward when the United States and President Reagan boycotted pipeline equipment in the early 1980s. The Germans thought this was not this risk because they can make a commercial deal which is working well. And the analysis, I think, was that the American wanted to limit Russia's abilities in economic and political spheres. And this disagreement you have across the Atlantic still. But I don't say that, I'm more difficult to see that the Russians will be more attractive for, will change the relationship. But I've also written a little about that when it's not only politics there, you have companies too. And you have, if you don't have legal grounds for all the things you do with between states, you can actually have an industry making deals. And that is partly the truth in the natural gas business, that you also have the company as such as actors in this, and they can make information to their governments and so on, but they will silently then accept it. So you have a more pragmatic, I would say, more maybe Germans think they are more pragmatic than in the States. But I don't see that they, from this point of view, actually are able to split EU countries. Gas less problematic now. Yes, that was the argument. That is that if you saw the map of development of pipelines over this in this Cold War period, you could say, and afterwards, it was an infrastructure where binding seller and buyer very close to each other. That's the case between Norwegian sellers and German and Belgian buyers. But it's also the case with Gazprom and Soyuz gas export, it was called in the Soviet times, now Gazprom, and the other countries. They were binding them together and they had no alternative, neither by contract nor by infrastructure. When you loosen this up and EU makes it more competitive, the market, that in itself make it less problematic. But if you also can make more infrastructure, so you actually can pipe gas from different sides, not only over one side, that will also make it less problematic. And then lastly, and most importantly, is the LNG trade popping up the last decade, where you have a lot of receiving terminals now in Europe, and taking gas from anywhere. And you have, like in Lithuania, for instance, they have a ship now in Klaipėda standing there as gas receiving terminals, and they are supplying their network now with Norwegian gas, while until recently they were depending on only one source, that was the pipeline from Russia, built during Soviet times. The dependency has been created since then. So many of these aspects, I think, one thing is EU regulations and policies, but another thing is the actual infrastructural developments and the LNG, which all makes it more flexible and competitive. So I think it's the gas dependency is not less in terms of that you need a lot of gas, but how to get it is much more flexible. So the problem of the dependency is much less. Cohesion. Oh, the cohesion EU-Germany, I think, had partly. commented already.
Yes, yes,
I
thank
hope.
you.
I hope.
No, thank you so much for answering all those questions. Perhaps we can have a final round, and we have another broader question about Russia again from Rana Baimarova, who asks whether you have any thoughts about the Trans-Anatolian gas pipeline and the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, and whether they will be beneficial in reducing Russian influence in that region.
What was the first pipeline?
Trans-Anatolian. So yeah.
Okay.
And then we have, I think, two interesting questions on China. One from Pierre-Charles Dernel, who asks, considering the growing divergence in energy interests between the US and the EU, do you expect EU-China rapprochement regarding renewables? And the additional question on China is from Maximilian Tetero, who asks, how likely is a Russian gas export shift towards China, and what do you think the consequences would be for the EU losing its buyer monopoly? And then there is one question on Africa from Stephen O'Shea, who asks whether we can assume that future African growth and associated energy needs will make it more dependent on the Gulf, and how will that shape its geopolitical relationship with the West? And perhaps I can add to this a more general question about developing countries, and whether we can see them perhaps not going along all the steps of the energy ladder, but rather step over certain fossil fueled based steps and go directly to the implementation of renewable energy sources. That's from Sarolta Samosi.
Okay.
Back to you.
The Trans-Anatolian pipeline is the same, more or less, as the Southern Corridor. I understand that you go from the cross from east to west, Turkey, and the Trans-Adriatic pipeline is a continuation, then the prolongation over to Greece or Albania, and from Albania to Italy, reaching the European network. That has been the competition, I understand, between the Russian gas and Azeri gas, that actually the one that gets these trunk lines established first will also have the best chance of expanding gas further on into the European markets. I know this project of Trans-Adriatic is not that attractive as it has been, because the Russians have built the Turk Stream. So it will, I think, it will all depends on how. I think the Russians hope that when they come with the gas through Turkey, that the EU will not have the same objections as they had building the South Stream to Bulgaria. But so I think it's open to see what the Turk Stream opened just recently in January this year, I think. So open to see what will come on there. I think that the southern corridor, the Trans-Anatolian pipeline, is you need to expand it a lot. It's a very expensive investment. I see that it's more difficulties now than with the Turk stream. And then we will see what is going on further on with the expansion towards the west. But now the gas comes from Turkey, and I don't know how this will be dealt with, it changing companies or whatever. To the China-US issue is, I think China needs all kinds of energy as much as they can. They are all over the world, finding resources, making deals, buying, growing where it's possible. As I showed in the graph, the coal has been the most important for the Chinese expansion over the last couple of decades. But it has some limitations too from a research perspective and also from an environmental perspective. I think also China, as I understood some Chinese colleagues I have with the Academy of Sciences there, that they are also needing, both from an environmental point of view, different policies, because it's very expensive not to have so polluted areas. They are actually interested in looking at the EU. I had meetings with people discussing this issue when I was at Harvard, that they need to find ways to deal with it. And as the EU is a forerunner in this area, on a political level, it is useful for them to have contacts in Europe with the EU and others to find out how to do it and also how to regulate it, actually. They also have started slowly to think about the domestic demand to add to the export-based industry and to some sort of a welfare state thinking. I understand they now started to give, like for pensioners, I think like 10 euro per month, which is not much, but it is much more than nothing. And it might be a start of something. So they're thinking in new ways, in a new expansive, new way China has to behave towards the rest of the world and also itself. They will also probably then, at least they look at everything probably, but also to Europe for these purposes. So in a concrete question as I made once, they actually said that they were looking at the EU as part of their model for future developments, meaning that they see the need for not running for being the world's factory only, but for building a society of their own. So I see, actually, in my terms, several times actually, that they look to Europe in terms of models. It will not be the copy, but they can make some adjustments to their own situation. At the same time, as a superpower, already, you can say probably, they have, like you seeing at the Belt and Road Initiative, it's large part of it is actually energy infrastructure. Either it is by sea and harbors and also by land and pipelines to Iran, huge reserves, will change their relation to the Middle East, who will take over US position in the Middle East. They are already there in China. So they will also build on the fossil fuels. And I see that they will do both. And they will also do the green energy and renewable stuff, learning from wherever it's possible. So some more cooperation, yes, but in several ways. I think you can see between Europe and China, and we'll see how this almost Cold War will go on between US and China, which might reinforce this change. Again, if America should be great again alone, Europe must be great again on a more independent ways too. And I think we have some qualities that we could be proud of across all countries and all differences of having a welfare state system, and be concerned with the environment and climate and so on. It actually here states must look to in order to develop. So yes, but again, we will still be a part of the Western system. So we are influenced by the disagreement with US and China as well. That might limit it. The Russian gas too. Well, when Putin he went to China a few years ago in order to establish the stronger routes for natural gas to China. So China is one direction they are swimming in order to get more energy, and Russia is a very energy rich country. It was difficult to build a corridor from Western Siberia to China because it's tremendous distances, and it's no one there almost. So it's a lack of infrastructure. But they made some plans for developing gas around the Baikal area, sea area, and a corridor. China and Russia has a direct border between Mongolia and what is the other state? Quite a narrow line. They're thinking of a pipeline development there, and they have also some LNG plant in Sakhalin in the east, so they can transport gas by boat. So it's more plans, and China wants to invest in Siberia, and they want to integrate somehow. At the same time, this is very much depending on state initiatives and state investment or state supported investments. So we'll see. But obviously what Russia thought that if Europe doesn't want us, let's go to China. They want us. And that is, again, if you look at it from a Russian point of view, they want to diversify too. So you have a desire both ways to integrate more, but we'll see. This is huge areas, and in Russia, much of it's rather unpopulated, and investments are enormous, and the projects must be enormous to be. You have a large scale advantages. You have to be enormous in order to be realized. So I think it's a bit more open to how fast it will be realized. But again, you have two governments, Chinese and Russian government, the state type of decision making, and then it might also be a decision, but they have to agree, which might not that be easy. So Africa, you can jump directly from to renewables. Try. One reason why, well, one thing is the supply of energy sources, oil, gas, coal. So it's easy to burn or to buy in a market. But it's also based on the infrastructure that is developed in rich countries. It's based on these energies. So if you should change, it's not only the price of the energy, it's also the price of changing equipment and infrastructure. And I think it would be wise if you can make it to as far as you can to change to do the renewable directly. And if you can make a solar plant based on your own sun, it makes sense when you see the cost curve for solar electricity. So that's one part of it. Well, I'm not an expert on Africa, but I know it's a lot of sun there, more than in Norway. And I would say that why don't you buy a solar panel from China, obviously, and develop your at least some of it. The most problematic for energy usage is that to change in transportation sector for lorries, cars, but for electricity production, you can use anything, including renewables. So I would say that should definitely look into that and rather build infrastructure for that as far as you can. Charolta Somosi. Hello. Sia. Nice to hear from you in Szeged. That was your question.
Indeed.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
I think that was the last you had, no?
Yes.
Indeed. Yeah. We're of course running out of time, so we'll ask perhaps Kolja for some concluding remarks.
Well, I don't want to keep our guest lecturer Gunnar Austvik much longer, because he has already spoken and tapped into so many different issues over the last 2 hours that it will become rather exhausting if I add a couple of questions now to this. But no, let me thank you again for what I think is a very important and a very timely debate. I think that indeed the geopolitics of energy are one of the examples, if not the example itself of geopolitics. We discussed it yesterday briefly when we were preparing for this lecture and webinar, and I think it became very clear that it is. I think there are so many aspects related to territory and the question of competition of territory, but also how, so to speak, states are then likely to basically try to tap into the scarce resources that we have on this planet, that this geopolitics of energy is likely to change but not to go away. And I think this is the main takeaway from the lecture today. It's going to be with us, but it may look very differently in the future, and that all depends obviously on the various actors involved and the decisions they make based on their interests. What does it mean for Europe? I guess it means, as we heard, that Europe will, in the long run, be perhaps a power, or perhaps a force of change in this, and at the same time, it will have to find ways to deal with the dependency. And I think what we see right now is obviously in the current crisis a great deal of thinking as well about how Europe can be more sustainable, more self-reliant in a way, and we will see what that means for the energy sector. So a lot of questions, I guess, rather than answers on all sorts of fronts. But thanks to your lecture, Ole Gunnar, it was that we could actually raise these questions. So thanks again. A big round of applause from my side for this extremely interesting lecture, and thanks for raising all of this.
Thank you, Kolja. Enjoyed it. Thank you. And Alex.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good day, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much. So I would indeed like to thank our speakers, Professor Ole Austvik and Professor Kolja Raube, as well as our audience members for taking part in this webinar. Stay tuned for updates on our upcoming webinars by following our Twitter page at EUCross. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join us again next time. Wishing you all the best from Ole, Kolja, and myself. It's thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.